That Triathlon Show 366. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Alan Murchison. Alan is a lifelong endurance athlete and one of few athletes to both run under 30 minutes for a 10K and ride under 18 minutes for 10 miles. He's also a chef with 25 years of experience in Michelin-starred kitchens, and today he runs Performance Chef, where he works with athletes from amateur level up to the highest possible level in sports of triathlon, cycling and other endurance sports. And we will discuss nutrition and food for triathletes and endurance athletes at a very practical level today with a practitioner who really knows what he's talking about, both regarding food and nutrition and endurance sports. It is a long interview, as you can see. That's always a good sign, I think, that it was a great conversation with lots of interesting topics and questions to tackle. And, Alan definitely can talk. There's no getting around that. A quick piece of housekeeping before we thank our sponsors and then head right into the interview. And this housekeeping item is a really important one, so please listen. I am currently running a listener survey about That Triathlon Show, and I would really like every single piece of feedback that I can get, because I'm really serious about improving the podcast, not just with small tweaks and small incremental improvements, but I'm ready to do significant changes based on what you, the listener, wants. So you can find the link to the survey in the episode description or in the navigation bar on scientifictriathlon.com, or just go directly to scientifictriathlon.com/survey. And I hope that you can take the time to fill this one out. That will help me make the podcast better. I will talk more about this in a future episode when I have done all the analysis from the responses to the survey, but I am a bit frustrated with the podcast this year, to be completely honest. I think things have gotten a bit stagnant and stale at times, and I'm not happy with that. I'm aware of that, and I want to improve things with your help. So that's why I'm asking you to help by taking this survey. All right, let's thank our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration. Precision Fuel and Hydration create sports nutrition products, both carbohydrate and hydration products, and they help you use them effectively through a range of free tools, services, and content. The Fuel and Hydration Planner on their website is a one-stop shop for figuring out an effective race hydration and fueling strategy for you. It's free and super easy to use. It only takes a couple of minutes to answer a handful of questions, and then you get a detailed, simple, and effective race plan. They also offer free video consultations. As a listener of the podcast, you can get 15% off your first order of the range of electrolyte and carbohydrate products by using the code TTS22 at checkout on precisionfuelandhydration.com. And thank you to Zen8. The Zen8 indoor swim trainer is a unique dryland swim trainer that allows you to improve technique, power, and swim training consistency. It is a perfect tool to complement your pool and open water swimming, as it allows you to do very specific power and technique work, including working on your catch and your core activation, and it makes it easier to stay consistent even when you can't go to the pool. You can even use it to do activation work before a pool or open water swim, or to do swim, bike, brick workouts more easily. You can try the Zen8 risk-free for up to 30 days, so if you don't love it, just send it back. And you can get a special TTS Zen8 bundle, including the swim bench and a bunch of Zen8 training plans and on-demand workouts on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, here's the interview with Alan Murchison. Welcome to That Triathlon Show, Alan. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm in a rainy UK, so as well as can be expected.
It's raining here as well, so I've had to postpone some sessions that I was going to do this morning, but it's all good. We've actually started talking, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, and now we're finally doing an interview, so that's quite funny. Can you introduce yourself to the listeners? Tell us more about who you are.
Brilliant. Okay, so my name's Alan Murchison. So I'm fairly confident of a couple of things. I'm probably the least academically gifted person you've had on your podcast by some margin, and I probably take the longest to respond to emails. So I think we're about 3 years ago we started correspondence about getting involved in the show. So my background is a Michelin star chef. I spent many years, in fact over 25 years, working in and running Michelin star restaurants, so high-end fine dining restaurants. I'm an ex-international runner, ran for Scotland, and then in my later years got into duathlon, and now predominantly I do time trialing as my sport. My role is a performance chef. That's kind of a self-titled role, and I work with Specialized Factory Racing at the moment, mountain bike team, and I travel on the road with them and work with their riders, both at races and away from races, doing nutritional plans for them. In the past, I worked for British Cycling, which I spent over 3 years working with the podium squad there. Last season, I was with Canyon SRAM, Women's World Tour team, do a little bit of work in Formula One, and also work with some athletes at Swiss Olympic Rowing.
Great. And within triathlon, I know you worked with some athletes there as well. Maybe it's on a private basis. I'm not quite sure, but can you give some context for your work with triathletes as well?
Yeah, I think probably the most famous athlete I worked with back in the day was Gwen Jorgensen. I was in touch with her and her husband Pat in the build up to Rio Olympics. So she was the first athlete of note that I worked with, and I got on really well with them and still keep in contact now. I work with quite a number of high profile triathletes now, but most of that's confidential stuff. They all want to keep the secrets to themselves.
Yeah.
As you know, with triathlon, it's not really a team sport. It's a very individual sport. So, but Gwen was the first athlete of real note that I worked with. And yeah, she was pretty special.
Yeah, absolutely. When you work with athletes, whether it's cyclists or triathletes or even Formula One athletes, what is the nature of that work? And maybe it varies, but you can describe the different varieties of that it takes. So what is your role and responsibilities in your role as a performance chef?
It's very, very different with each individual athlete. So, for example, with Specialized Factory Racing, I'm on the road with them, all the World Cups, World Championships, training camps, and that'll be doing all the food, all the nutritional planning, and very individual plans for each rider at events. With some professional athletes I work with who are on the road a lot, it might be a matter of hooking up with them, doing cookery lessons, showing them how to shop and how to give them solutions around the environment they're in. So they might be in an Airbnb, they might be having to navigate a hotel buffet, or they could be completely self-sufficient. So it depends very much on the athlete and the needs of the athlete. And as you know yourself, athletes' skills around food and cooking are hugely varied. So some athletes, you could send them a recipe and say, cook this. Others, you literally have to walk them through a supermarket and show them how to shop in individual areas. So it will depend on the pro athlete. And then our core business at home is doing sort of food and nutrition plans alongside coaching. So for example, if you said to me, hi, I'm Michael, I work from Monday to Friday in an office doing tech, and I train 12 hours a week, and I want to qualify for World 70.3, sort of case study there. What I would do is I would go onto your training peaks, and when your training was in for the following week, I would upload a food plan that sits alongside your training peaks and then send you a shopping list. So you've got all your sort of performance solutions in one place. So if, for example, your coach put in, you were doing a 45-minute swim and a 2-hour bike ride, I'd put the food into training peaks so the two sit alongside. So that's a service that we offer for some athletes, and others it will be a matter of, I have athletes regularly who phone me out, go, I'm at the hotel buffet, what do I eat? Or there's nothing to eat in the hotel, or we're traveling and staying in an Airbnb and there's an Aldi, what do I buy? So it's very reactive to the individual situation.
Yeah, so if I'm that worker in the tech industry with 12 hours a week to train, is that the food plan that you put in Training Peaks? Is it an entire everything that I should eat for the day, including snacks, including fueling during the training, unless the coach puts it there? Or is it more like, okay, your key meals, your breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and then add snacks around that? How detailed is it?
Again, depends on the athlete. Some athletes want to know everything. They want to even know timings, 3 hours before. So it'll depend on the athlete's knowledge. And as you're aware of being a coach yourself, athletes are on a journey. I hate that term, but they're always on a journey and their knowledge is building up. So some athletes, you don't need to tell them to eat a snack 3 hours before a session. Other athletes are really much more prescriptive. So what we'll do is we'll give them as much or as little information as you know, and it kind of balances out, because for every athlete that's requiring a lot of attention, a lot of detail, you'll have somebody that's quite happy with a shopping list and a very loose plan. So again, it depends on the individual athlete. The main one that we try and focus on as well is making sure that they're practicing in training what they're going to put into place for key events. So we'll, again, get them in the habit of trying to fuel on the bike or fuel for hard sessions, and where possible, just simplify it. So very individual approach, to be honest.
Mm. And yeah, this is a bit off the cuff. It's not in the list of questions that I sent to you, but where do you feel you make the most impact, the biggest difference? Is it with some of your pro athletes, or is it with age group athletes?
That's a really, really good off the cuff question. I would say the main thing with them is the accountability is great. As you know, people only ever do two things in life. This is an Alan saying. They do two things in life. They do things they enjoy and things by which they can be held accountable. So if I can make the food enjoyable and tasty, and if it's in the training peaks, everybody likes a green light in training peaks. We all like those green lights. So if they can hit the training block and they can hit the session and the food's enjoyable and it's easy, then I think that makes a massive, massive difference. Again, I find recreational athletes hugely satisfying to work with because in some respects, pros are really easy because they've got nothing else to worry about. It's their job. So if you think about, even if you're doing, at the high end, 25, 30 hours a week, it's not like having a 40-hour a week job and kids and a family and all those other things that to work with. So, but in some respects, professional athletes are a lot easier because they've got that very clear focus about what they're doing. It's when you've got people that are maybe on a conference call and have to delay a session by an hour, or they have to move everything for a day because life's got in the way. I think that's a lot more challenging, really. But the accountability is the key one. If it's in training peaks, people will want to do it. It's that accountability. And as you know, you get to a level in the sport and you might have been doing it for years, but most coaches are coached themselves because they need the accountability. And I think that's something that's really important, is that, it's just taking away the thinking. That's really key for me.
Yeah. And I'm projecting a little bit from myself, but also definitely this applies to the large majority of athletes that I coach, that one big thing is making it quick, as you already mentioned, but the combination of quick and enjoyable. Like personally, for example, I can make some really nice food, or I can make some really quick food. But combining the two, that's not necessarily that easy. That's where I feel like maybe I could use some help. And actually, I'm fine with eating boring food that's quick to make for during the week, and that works for me. But if you're somebody for whom that gets a little bit old, and you only have those 20 minutes to cook basically, but you want something that tastes better than rice and beans, then that's where, like, I think it can probably make a huge impact if you get some inspiration with recipes and stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And if you've got a shopping list, so say, for example, Michael, your hypothetical 70.3 athlete, if I send you a shopping list and you've got the ingredients in the fridge, or you've got a store cupboard and you've got rice and you've got pasta, you've got chickpeas, you've got top tomatoes, all you need essentially is some fresh protein and some veggies, and you can make a really healthy, nutritious meal. But if you've climbed off the turbo after 90 minutes and you go and shop in your local supermarket and you're hungry, you'll just eat any old rubbish. And that's where the thing is, that reactive eating is probably the biggest mistake. So I would say that if you've got a list and you've got the ingredients, it's no different to if you've got a busy day, you've got an 8 or 9 hour day, and you've got some intervals to do on the turbo. You've got your turbo set up, you've got your bike on there, you've got your towel, you've got all your stuff. You just jump on. But if you've got to think about it, you've lost that moment, really. So it's planning.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's jump into discussing some key principles of nutrition for triathletes and endurance athletes. And I was thinking maybe you can give a few, as an overview, give a few do's and don'ts. And if we start within training nutrition, what would you say are the key principles there?
I think the main thing is to make sure you're fueling for the work required. And often I hear this term a lot of fasted sessions. And for me, a session is something that involves quality or hard work. It's not necessarily just turning your legs over. And I think that's something, under fueling key sessions is something that I think is done all too often. And then they'll go into a state of depletion and just graze for the rest of the day. So I think it's really important that you almost, like you would lay your kit out for the weather. You almost think, right, this is what I'm going to have to eat today to get through this session. If you have the mindset that every single training session has a purpose. So you as a coach will put in stuff for repair and recovery, people for practicing race pace, and then stuff that's over and above that. That's what you'll do as a coach. If you think about your food in the same way, that is this going to help fuel this session? This is going to help me repair or recover. So I would say that that's something that's really, really important. Every single training session does have a purpose, and you need to be careful that you're not following what somebody else is doing on social media, or you're just looking at it, and you've got to fuel for the work required. I also think using, say, again, I'm saying Training Peaks as an example. If you actually use like the diary within Training Peaks and you take notes of how certain foods make you feel or how you performed after certain sessions, again, I think that's really, really important. I tend to use a lot of examples of things I do myself, because I find it very hard to recommend or be passionate about anything in performance sport unless I've tried it myself. And like last night, I was only going on to do 4x5 minutes on the turbo, right? So relatively straightforward. But I knew that I was going to the gym afterwards. So for that ride, it was 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off by 4. And what I'm doing is building up the power as each one goes on. So it's only 20 minutes of work. I took 90 grams of carbs for that block that I was on. But I didn't eat until later on. And I made sure that I wasn't going into the gym depleted, and I was finishing this session that I wasn't completely on my knees. And I think that's something that's really, really important. I knew what I was going to eat afterwards. I knew what I was going to have for breakfast today. And I think that overall planning for that work is really important, because theoretically, 20 minutes of work, it's not that much. But it's the level of intensity, like it's over my FTP. It's hard work. So I think that's something that's really, really important. And also to look at the amount of carbs that you're taking in during key sessions. I'll talk about that a little bit more, and how to sort of track that. And I think that's something that's really important. But look at the work and look at what's involved. That's something, again, I always use the analogy of driving. If you were driving from London to Edinburgh, you'd never set off with a quarter of a tank of fuel, any more than you need to put 50 litres of fuel in your car if you're going to nip round to the supermarket. You've got to look at the physical stresses, and then you've got to make sure you've got enough fuel in the tank for it. And the fuel cracks me. I'll go out with athletes sometimes, and I'll watch what they've got on the bike or how much they're eating or drinking, and it cracks me. I'll wear out for 3 hours with 1,500 meters of climbing, and they'll have one bottle on the bike, and you're going, well, what is that? How does that work? How does it? And it doesn't work because, they're kidding themselves on, I don't need to have that much. And then they'll get in and they'll just be eating for the next 5 or 6 hours. So yeah, day-to-day training, look at the work and then plan accordingly.
Yeah. And it's something for me within my coaching. I've more recently, I guess in the last year or so, started to more and more, at least for certain athletes that I think need that guidance, always put in a minimum number of carbohydrates per hour that they need to consume based on the session. So sometimes it might be 60, sometimes it might be 90, and if it's an easy run or short easy bike, I might not put in anything, like they can get through 45 minutes and that's fine. But I think that's something that I've become more aware of, like just how important it is to always fuel for the work required. And there's in the scientific world as well, there's been more and more interesting work done on the concept. I'm going to probably misremember the term, but it's something like within day energy availability, that you can not just, if you add up all of your energy intake over the day, you might be perfectly fine. But if you go for a period of 3 or 4 hours where you actually run the tank really low, as you say, then that in itself can be very hurtful for you. And there's more and more scientific evidence coming out. It's a topic that I do want to talk about on the podcast in the future from a scientific sense. But just for listeners to be aware that is a concept that's out there. Basically how every hour counts within the day.
Yeah, I think it's also as well, and it's something that's really difficult to quantify, is external stresses on energy levels. Now, you and I know that if say if you and I sat on a bike and we rode our bike at 300 watts, so we went and ran at kilometers at 3 minutes, we know what that would do. But what about lack of sleep? What about external stresses of work and general life? And that has a huge impact. And I know personally I'm hypersensitive to sleep. If I don't have sleep, I need to go to top end of fueling zone to get through certain sessions. And that's something that's really, really difficult. And I don't know what your thought are, on wearable tech like Oura rings or Whoop bands or whatever. But I can see sometimes the most stressful and the days that I have so much going on are days that I'm not actually on the bike or training. It's quite remarkable. So again, we don't know what the impact that is. And you might not have a massive calorie deficit, but again, if you're having to concentrate a lot, the only fuel your brain can use is carbohydrate. And we see that in Formula One. Like, you think, okay, physically they're sat down, but you've got to make split-second decisions. And carbohydrate is brain food. And there's so much around that we don't know, and we're making it up as we go along. And, that's why I think it's something that's really important, that if you can fuel your sessions, then hopefully the rest of life will fall into place. But sometimes you can just feel absolutely exhausted for no reason. Your training load can be really low. And, I had a conversation with a professional athlete this morning who was exhausted today, absolutely exhausted. It's rest day. So he's taken the kids to school. He's walked the dog. He's cleaned the house. He's gone and serviced the car. And it's more exhausting than doing a 6-hour base ride. And he's absolutely wrecked by lunchtime because he's not doing the thing that he naturally does. And mentally, these things are all, he's making small talk in the school playground. And as an introvert, that's actually really tiring for that athlete. So yeah, it's a fascinating field, I think,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I do think that in the last few years, there's a positive trend of more awareness and knowledge among athletes, I think, about at least not what we had, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years ago of intentionally underfueling almost, or not intentionally underfueling, but trying to basically get shortcuts by skipping fueling during training and hoping that would improve performance, which we now know pretty clearly that it doesn't.
Yeah.
But I still think that the gap between knowledge about the importance of fueling in training and actually applying it in the day-to-day is there. Like, some athletes do it very well. Some athletes might on a theoretical level realize that, it's great, fueling during training is great, but they actually don't do it, or they do it to a more limited extent than they should be doing it.
Yeah, but this will kind of run into stuff that we'll no doubt cover later on, that so many athletes are obsessed about weight. We should come back to that, because I think it's a metric or something, it's a guide. If I look at overall energy intake throughout a day, I think that's something that's really, really important. And as you know yourself, training is normally consisted of easy, medium, and hard. Now, what is easy, medium, hard? Now, if you go down the sort of Coggin scale of 1 to 7 of your training zones, that's great, all right? But what about residual fatigue? And what I found, and I know you could be skeptical about, say, apps that track your metrics, right? So let's go MyFitnessPal. It's cheap. It's free. How good is the tech on it? I know for a fact that if I track my metrics, and we've got two ways of tracking metrics. We've got MyFitnessPal, which I use as a day-to-day, just as a rough guideline. And then we've also got a bit of software that we use when we're doing recipe development, or we're doing any stuff, high-end recipe development that we need micro detail, a platform called Nutritics. And it's used an awful lot in sort of sports science. So Nutritics has got more detail than you'll ever need. So I know for a fact, if I'm doing hard work is in Tabata intervals, sweet spot, overgeared work, whatever the hell nastiness that I'm doing, I know that over the course of a day, my overall carbohydrate intake is normally about 70% of my daily intake, and that's on and off the bike. So it'd be 70% carbs, be 20% protein and 10% fat. Getting in fat is never an easy one. If I'm doing a medium day, so that for me would be tempo work, it could be long, slow ride, could be 4 or 5 hours, heart rate between 108, 118. So that kind of base zone, I know it goes to 60, 30, 10. So 60% carbs, 30% protein, 10% fat. On rest days, it's almost flipped on its side, that I'm 40% carbs, 60% protein, 10% fat. And I know that from a period of time. So when I'm putting together my meal plans, I'll make sure that I try and go along those parameters. Now, that works for me as a 50-year-old athlete that burns a shitload of carbs. So I know that I can take on 100 to 110 to 120 grams of carbs per hour when I'm going hard. That's kind of the zones that I use for the fueling when the hard work's required. However, the caveat in that is that I think you've actually got to look at multiple days. You've got to look at residual fatigue. And, I got an email in from you every day about, training camps. People go on training camps, and I think they underfuel them so often. The facts are, if you look at a stage race, or a stage race for an athlete, a recreational athlete, it's a training camp because it's multiple hard days back to back. Female athletes are taking on 8 to 10 grams of carbs per kilo body weight per day. male athletes 10 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilo of body weight per day. Now, if you measure that out, you put it in front of you on a table, you'd go, oh my God, but that's what we're seeing if they're going to look to perform day after day. And hard, I think, is really difficult. What's hard? Like, it's hard just going out with a group that's a wee bit faster than you, or it's hard multiple days, or it's hard 2 hours sleep deficit a night. I don't know what hard is. And what I'll say to you is, if you can look at those training blocks, and I've just come back, I was fortunate that I was in Girona doing some work. I did 10 days in Girona. I did 45 hours on the bike, and I had carb heavy every single meal. So I was having carbs for breakfast, carbs for lunch. I was taking 70 to 90 grams of carbs per hour. And I know that I was initially that shock. I was fatigued at the start of the block. By the end of it, my Whoop was giving me greens all throughout. My recovery was really good. And I did my best 20-minute power on day 9 of 10 because I made sure that I wasn't constantly running into deficit. So I think if you can use, say, for example, even it is MyFitnessPal, just to get an idea of the macros of carbohydrate, fat and protein. And that's something I think that you need to try and learn yourself. You're seeing now, certainly male world tour riders of 70 kilos are taking on 110, 120 grams of carbs per hour. That's something that 5 years ago, I would have been 40, 50 grams less than that. 80 used to be the benchmark, 100, now it's about 120. So I think just look at all of and also the stuff that you have off the bike, I think is really important. That is really, really important. And it's,
I think first of all, there was a lot of great information there. So let's see. I have a couple of follow-ups or comments. First of all, regarding MyFitnessPal, that's personally my perspective on it is every once in a while I'll try to track it for. Ideally, I would do it for 3 days. Sometimes I just can't do it after 2 days because it's too much of a hassle. But 2 days, I think I'm pretty fine with. Like, I get an idea, and I basically recalibrate my intuition for how much I'm getting in when I'm eating the way I normally do during a normal training block, and how much is carb, how much is protein. And I think that getting enough carbs, getting enough proteins, that's really what you want to look for when you're tracking. I think at least for most athletes, I don't know if you disagree, then do let me know. But I think for most people, it's probably not at all necessary or even useful to track every single day, but to have a calibration period when you basically get more self-awareness of what you're doing and can correct things. That's a really useful way of using that kind of tracking.
I 100% agree. I go in blocks of using MyFitnessPal, and you talk about self-awareness. I think that's something that's becoming less and less prevalent, and it's a skill set that I think that is really important, because nowadays, we can track how many hours we sleep, what type of sleep we've got, our left right leg balance, and I think a lot of it is great, and it's great for you as coaches because you can look at an athlete's platform remotely and you can they're doing this, that, or the other, and they're sleeping really well, and they've got this amount of REM, and the leg balance is fantastic. You've got all these numbers, but that self-awareness is something that's something that I think is lacking, and you can't teach it. You've got to. It's got to be through experience, and I would agree. MyFitnessPal does involve a lot of faff. Especially if you're going to add up all your ingredients, and that can then to lead to obsessive behavior around food, because you start weighing stuff out. That is literally your first foot over the doorstep of having some form of disordered eating. And it's always an elephant in the room, and we should talk about it, but it's something that's really important. So what I would tend to do is try and simplify it. So if you think, okay, well, how do you feel as a person? What are your energy levels like? Do you want to get out the door? Do you have sniffles? Are you sleeping well? Those are all metrics there's a human element to it. And I also think, if I gave you a plan, Michael, even a 3-day rolling plan, and said, right, here's a medium day, and a medium day could be really easy, and I'm going to rattle it off the top of my head. Bircher muesli for breakfast, 50 grams of oats, 50 grams of Greek yogurt, 50 ml of milk, 50 ml of apple juice. Okay, put some seeds and nuts to get you good fats and stuff in there. That's a good breakfast. Okay, lunch could be, you're busy because you've got to get on the office, a tin of tuna, chopped avocado, and a bag of pre-cooked rice. Mix that with some salad. You've got protein, fat, and carbohydrate. Your snack could be a bagel with nut butter and jam. That's it. It doesn't need to be overcomplicated. And dinner could be some slow-release carbohydrates, either rice or couscous. You make a Moroccan tagine up, so you've got tinned tomatoes, chickpeas, some spices, peppers, and some protein, some chicken, and some fresh herbs. That's it. That's a medium day. And that gives you protein, carbs, and fat all throughout your day, all store-cupboard ingredients that you can pick up. You go, oh, I've got a hard day. Well, have a banana and a tablespoon of honey with breakfast. Have a banana at lunchtime. Have some baked sweet potatoes with dinner, and you can suddenly take your carbohydrate intake up by another 30%. So if you can and it's a bit like you don't need 50 Tabata type sessions. You don't need 10 different sweet spot sessions. It's a bit like you don't need 10 different breakfasts or 10 different lunches or 10 different main meals. And I think people run the risk of overcomplicating. And I think if you can keep it simple and achievable, and right, this is a low carbohydrate breakfast, so this is a high carb breakfast, or if you put your notes and training peaks, go, do you know what, I was at top end of zone today. I was cracking today. I was pinging. And then you look back and go, well, I had that for breakfast and I had that for dinner. Job done. You don't need to overanalyze it. And that self-awareness, I think, is something, I work on a lot, and I think it's really important. But yeah, don't start weighing your food all the time. That's dangerous. And that's something we'll talk about a little bit later on, because I've got some stuff around that I want to talk about with you. But I think it's
for sure. Yeah, I think just on that, like if you do that, when you do that, let's say calibration period, then you have to do it with going in with the exact right mindset of like, what is the objective? You're just trying to understand what you're currently doing, and not from the perspective of, oh, this is my key to lose weight or something.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing as well is I always, even at the highest level, apply 80-20 rule to food. 80% good stuff, 20% bad stuff. And I hate the term bad stuff, because nothing's bad in moderation. But if it's red wine, if it's chocolate, if it's cheese, it doesn't matter what it is. If that's your thing, and if you can get through a block, and you can get through a 3-month or a 16-week training block, and you can say I had 80% of this was fit for purpose, and you know what? I had that bit of chocolate, or, as a family, we went out and we had a pizza. That's all about moderation, and that's about having a healthy relationship with food. And at the very highest level, you'll see that. That is something that's really important. And whether it's that dirty burger or whatever, it doesn't matter what it is. Just make sure you get that balance in your life.
Yeah, and that's something that I was going to talk about as well, especially with you coming from a Michelin star restaurant background. Like the food is not just nutrition; it's enjoyment. It's enjoyment for the food, but also the social aspect of it. And same with, let's say, if you have a wine or a beer, or like chocolate or candy with your kids when you go to an amusement park or something. Like those things all matter, and if they psychologically make a positive impact, then that's just one more reason to have those 20% of like less fit for purpose food, or whatever you want to call it.
Exactly, and I think there's a thing for like non-specific training. I go out and I like just take my gravel bike out, and I don't even take a Wahoo or anything with me. I just go out and I ride my bike and take pictures for Instagram, and mentally, that is so good for you, because, again, being a time trialist, looking at your metrics, I'm hiding behind my hands. Everything is all about drag and CDA and watts per kilo and all that stuff. It sucks the joy out of it a lot of the time. Whereas there's a lot to be said for, just going out and enjoying a meal. Like last night, I'll be honest with you, I did my turbo session. I went to the gym, had this holistic approach. There's a new burger restaurant open in town. I went and had a Burping Ron's Big Ron double patty with fries last night, because you know what? I had quite a hard day and I couldn't be bothered cooking. Even at my level, I couldn't be bothered cooking. I thought, should we go for a dirty burger? So we went and had dirty burger with cheese. Within the context of the week, that's really good, and I think that's something that's really important. And, when you look at like the Michelin star environment, that high performing team in that environment, and you see the joy in people's faces, and you've seen how the table brings people together. And it's something really special. And I think the social element around food is something that's kind of lacking these days. People, and the ironic thing is, people will buy a pre-prepared meal or a ready meal, and they'll sit in front of the television watching people cook, which just blows my mind. Cooking, it's mad. Whereas it almost seems to be that the cooking from scratch or cooking everything is seen as a middle-class hobby these days. Whereas if you look at, say, your grandparents' generation, I'm sure they weren't buying stuff in. They were making bread. They were, they probably had eggs from the chickens that were running about in the garden, and they did everything from scratch. Whereas now, cooking from scratch, wow, that's middle class. That's a posh hobby. It shouldn't be. It should be the other way around.
Yeah, totally. Let's go back to the key principles. We got a lot of stuff done there, but yet if there's anything else that we didn't already mention in terms of the day-to-day nutrition outside of training, of let's say do's and don'ts that you see, what would you say there?
I would say I wouldn't. The two things that I do is, people get. I'm more concerned about macros, as in your fat, your protein, and carbs for training. So we've covered that. I think that's really important. The micronutrients, all your vitamins and minerals. Theoretically, if you're having a balanced diet, as in you're eating your fruit and your veg, and you're getting your protein from different sources, as in fish and meat and pulses and dairy, I wouldn't worry about it. In the Western world, actual deficiencies are rare. They are rare. And that then leads on nicely to supplementation. The supplementation business is a multi-billion business. And I'll be honest with you, I think there's a lot of snake oil out there. There's a lot of stuff that I don't know whether it does any good at all. Personally, I've tried every supplement in the world. I've tried to measure it. I've tried to see what effects it have on my health and well-being. I can't tell you what works and what doesn't work. And if you read the literature, if you look at the proper nerdy sports scientists, and I would say, bearing in mind, Instagram isn't the place you go for these places. But if you look online, if you look at, say, the man, Oscar Jakendrap, who is God as far as I'm concerned with sports supplementation and knowledge around this, there's very little hard facts around, supplementation and what good it does to you. The first and foremost thing you need to think of, and you have this as mine, as any practitioner in sport, you've got to think the worst thing that could happen for an athlete that you work with is they fail a drugs test. Majority of failed tests are from contaminated supplements. Now, I'm fortunate or unfortunate that the world that I work in, I've got to have my anti-doping accreditation and all that. So the rules are that the advice always you would give to athletes is, if in doubt, don't take it, because there's a risk with taking supplementation. And personally, if I'm traveling or if I'm under any periods of high stress, I take HealthSpan Elite. I'm not sponsored by them. I buy it with my own money. It's a product that's been batch tested. I take a multivitamin, I take cod liver oil, and I take a probiotic when I'm traveling, just because I know my diet might not be great. They come in a box that gives you a week's supply, and I use those. And I'll also take vitamin C and zinc, again, when I'm under high stress or I'm traveling. The rest of the stuff, I'm not convinced. I take beta-alanine before races. It makes me tingling. Can I give you a performance benefit? No. Done beetroot, gives me an upset stomach. Not convinced. So I would say I wouldn't worry about supplementation unless you've got something fundamentally wrong with you. I think if your diet's good, then don't worry about it. First and foremost, don't fail a test. That is something that's really important. And you imagine the implications as a professional athlete. Firstly, that's it. As a recreational athlete, can you imagine going in the office on a Monday morning and you've failed a drugs test because you've taken some cod liver oil or iron supplements you've got cheap, man? Can you imagine? You'd look such a fool. It's just,
they do test amateurs. Like, it's not that often, but they do. Like, I heard about it in, I can't remember even if it was Kona or St. George recently, but there's always testing even for or not always, but there's testing even for amateur athletes. So it is like, I know that many athletes think that this doesn't apply to me. I'm not a professional, but it does. And you're absolutely right. Like, if you have to walk into the office and they ask, how did your Ironman go? And you say, I was disqualified, I failed a drugs test. And that would just be terrible, devastating.
Well, we've got a couple of clients. We've got one who's a teacher in a private girls' school. She was tested at an age group event fairly recently, and I think she was fourth or something like that. So they weren't even testing the podium. And certainly in domestically in the UK, there was quite a lot of amateur testing a few years ago. I haven't seen any testers for a couple of years, to be honest, at races, but it's just not worth it. And again, you've got to look at risk versus reward. Is this going to make you a better athlete? Arguably, it might be 1% at best, but there's no slam dunkers in there, to be honest, Michael. There's none. Can you think of any? You think any supplement that is going to be, right, I'm going to take this and it's worth it? I can't. I think of anything.
Yeah, no, but caffeine is good for a lot of people. You have to obviously get used to using it and use it in the right amount and the right timing. I have an episode about that. I'll link to it in the show notes. There is a great paper, an IOC position statement about supplementation, and they basically go through all of the supplements and list some that are useful. And I think vitamin D is one that a lot of Northern Hemisphere athletes generally benefit from, because a lot of people end up being deficient in vitamin D. So that's something I take, and I take iron because I tend to get low on iron. So, but that's tested and doctor prescribed iron essentially. So yeah, it's if you have a specific deficiency. I have to challenge you a bit though, because when you listed the things that you take, that's quite a lot considering that you don't believe in supplements.
No, I will take them when I'm traveling. If I'm away with work, and I know if I'm at work that I might not be able to eat, so the fact is I'm a multivitamin, cod liver oil, and a probiotic, and then vitamin C with zinc. Those are just trying to make sure I don't get ill when I'm away, because my diet when I'm working, ironically, is not the best that it could be. So that's it. And the other things, I've tried loads of different things, and I thought, I don't see any benefit other than I've got less money to spend on bike bits. That's it.
Yeah.
I'm poorer. That's it. I don't get it. So, and the caffeine one, caffeine I do take before. I don't really see caffeine as a supplement, but it probably is. I do take caffeine gum before races, and I'll take caffeine gels if I'm doing longer rides. So I do take that. I don't really see that as a supplement, but it probably is.
I would, even if you look at the IOC consensus statement, then even carbohydrate is a supplement when you take it as a gel or a sports drink. So that's a supplement that works that we can agree on.
I completely agree. Yeah, I would agree. So yeah, but I would say that those are the day-to-day things that I would avoid and not worry about. Just say get a balanced diet, and just it's, even if you take old-fashioned advice of having X amount of fruit and veg, is it 5 to 8 pieces of fruit and veg a day? If you're doing that and you're not having too many processed, when I mean processed, artificially prepared foods, and you're getting your protein from different sources, in honesty, you shouldn't have too many worries. It's when you do these exclusion diets, etc., that you're going to have issues. But I think that would be the day-to-day stuff that I would be more concerned about.
Yeah. So can you talk about that a little bit? Diets, exclusions, and obviously it can be both from something like a health perspective, like somebody is intolerant to something, or it can be voluntary. But what are your thoughts on different diets, and also for people that they did really need to be on some sort of diet or exclusion diet, then what things do they need to do to basically compensate for the lesser variety or lesser choice that they have?
It's a really interesting topic. Now I've been fortunate that I've been working in food since probably you were born. When did I start? 15. I've been 35 years plus working in food. I go 20 years ago. Exclusion diets didn't exist, and allergies or intolerances didn't exist. People didn't like stuff, but nowadays you can't say you don't like something. You've got to have some intolerance to it. So it's become very trendy and it's become very popular. And I think if you've got something that's medically prescribed, as in whether it's dairy or gluten or you're celiac, that is very different to saying, well, I've got a mild intolerance to it. And that is a very different thing. So I take a lot of exclusion diets with a pinch of salt, because I've seen all sorts of things from, for example, with British cycling, we had 2 athletes who were both podium athletes, so Olympic level athletes. And one of the guys, brilliant athlete, great guy, he had a huge stress reaction when he was at races. And he had it was a diagnosed thing, a FODMAP diet, which is a real nightmare to work with. You put him in a training camp, didn't exist. Put him in a race scenario, he had IBS come up. It was stress related. And that was something that was really difficult to manage, because as soon as you put him in a high pressure environment, his IBS flared up. That's something that's really unusual. So the main ones are dairy. There are people that are intolerant to dairy. There's nowadays a hell of a lot of really good non-dairy products available. You go to any supermarket in Europe, you can get milk, cheese, you can get everything. I would just say be aware that just because something's an exclusion, it doesn't mean it's healthy. Because if you look at, say, a butter substitute, that's margarine. That's what it is. That's horrendous. You'd almost be better not having it than having a butter substitute. And I think you have to be aware that there's a lot of bad stuff that's jumping on this exclusion bandwagon. So dairy-free, you can basically replace everything nowadays in most supermarkets, from egg substitutes, even though, eggs don't come from cows. They're always banded under dairy-free. And I think that's something you can do. Gluten is a really interesting one. And I've got a bit of an anecdotal story with that. I personally thought that was rubbish. And it must have been 5 or 6 years ago, And, as a triathlete, you run, and I was a runner first and foremost, and I always had runner's stomach. I always had that stomach that I'd always, if I was ever going out running, especially if I was doing intervals, I'd always have a dodgy stomach. So I'd always be in the bushes. This is quite graphic, but you know what? I don't need to elaborate on this. And I had a girlfriend, a new sparkly girlfriend about 6 years ago who was gluten-free. And I said, it's nonsense. I'll trial it. So I trialed it for a month and I was absolutely devastated because I did not want this to work. So we talk about the placebo effect of products. I was the anti-placebo effect. This was going to make no difference to me at all. And within about 5 days of removing gluten from my diet, the difference in my energy levels, my physical stomach function, how I felt in myself was night and day. Now, I do not test intolerant to gluten at all, or wheat, nothing. I don't. I've got no, but I'll tell you factually, it makes a huge difference to me. So obviously gluten's in stuff like soy sauce. It's in pasta, which is the worst for my stomach. It's horrendous for me. So if you think before, I'd go to races and I'd have your typical high carb pasta meal, have a really bad stomach. Pasta destroys my stomach, always does. And I took it out of my diet, and I would say I'm 90% gluten-free now. I don't show up on any testing. However, if you start reading up on it and you go looking down that rabbit hole, there's chemicals that are used in the harvesting of wheat, which can have a huge effect. So I can be tolerant to wheat and gluten, but I get reaction to the chemicals that are in it. And if you look at, say, an ancient grain like spelt, for example, the farming of spelt and the manufacturing of spelt, they don't really use a lot of chemicals. I have no reaction to spelt flour at all, nothing. But wheat flour destroys my stomach, but I'm not tolerant to it. So I would say, if you've got any doubt, first of all, you can go and pay one of these many amazing companies to do intolerance testing, which is hugely expensive, and quite often they're creating a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. Take it out of your diet, monitor it for 2 weeks, then reintroduce it to your diet. If you get a reaction, keep it out. It's as simple as that. That's what I would say with certainly wheat, with gluten. I'm better without gluten. That's it. Plain and simply, I'm not tolerant to it. So those are the two main ones. We then go down the Pandora's box of veganism, which is something I think is really, really important to talk about. And it's one that I get asked about a hell of a lot. And obviously, in the last few years, you've had Game Changers on Netflix, which was a really interesting documentary. And you've also had Seaspiracy, which are two worth watching. So again, if you can assume that any factual documentary that's on Netflix is there to generate interest and provoke reaction. So let's assume that 40% of what we're seeing is factually correct and the rest is smoke screens and mirrors. That's probably a fair assumption because it's opinions we're talking about here. High performance sport. You can Google this while you're online. Name me 10 world-class endurance athletes who are plant-based. Any sport you like, I don't mind. We've got all day. Name me them. You can't.
I've been thinking about this many times, and you're right. I can't. So I'm not even trying to do it off the cuff, but
yeah, but you can't, and there's good reason behind, because there's no evidence to suggest that a plant-based diet has got any performance benefit. Now, if I go back to, and I'm digging myself a hole here, but I've got the shovel to get myself back out. If I go back to when I worked with British Cycling, I was with them for a number of years, and we've got unlimited resources. So we can, the infrastructure, there's 240 people work there. Yeah, there was nothing that they could find that would say having a plant-based or an exclusion diet has got any performance benefit, because they would be doing it. Within the whole Olympic program, there was one athlete who was vegetarian for ethical reasons, because she trained as a vet and she preferred to save animals as opposed to eating them. That was it. Everybody else ate everything. They all had milk, cheese. They all had everything. That extreme. Ethically and environmentally, we don't need to have that argument. Ethically, farming practices are hugely variable, and the ethics side of it, we don't need to have that conversation, because the ethics around animal farming and the stuff is horrific, to be honest. Environmentally, it has an impact as well. So those things have been proven beyond doubt. But purely performance-based, there's nothing that suggests that it would give you any performance. What I would suggest you do, and again, I look at these things as a human, first of all, is eat good quality meat, make sure it's free range, make sure it's organic, go to the farm, etc. I eat meat less often as a result of probably social awareness, actually looking at the environmental impact. We probably have a day Well, certainly I have a vegan day probably once or twice a week, and I'll have a vegetarian day another day. So I'm only eating meat maybe 4 times a week now, as opposed to I was eating it twice a day, 7 days a week before. And I would just say, be aware of what you're doing. Also, if you look at the people that are listening to this podcast, Michael, nobody's listening to this podcast because they want to get slower. Okay, this isn't light-hearted banter, and it's not a couple of lads down a pub talking. It's not one of those podcasts. So generally, your audience will be people that want to improve their performance through sport. If they're going to any event and they've invested heavily in coaching, travel, they've ticked the box to get there. They've invested a hell of a lot, both financially, emotionally, physically, in getting to the start line. What they don't want to do is get to the key race, which could be in Middle America or Central Europe, and have to worry about where the dinner's coming from. So I would say that, and I advise a lot of the athletes I work with, it's really common now that people are aware of plastics, they're aware of travel, they're aware of the whole environment, is have a flexitarian approach. Is when you're at home and you can choose to make better choices, do it. But when you're at races, just go with what you know works. Do you know what I mean? Because if you try going to Belgium or France or Spain and you say, well, I'm going to have a vegetarian diet, you will be depleted. What protein you're going to get? Do you know what I mean? It's those types of things that you have to worry about. So I get the ethics, but from purely a performance benefit, there's not an awful lot there. And don't get to your key event that you've sweated and you've worked really hard to get there, and you've made a huge investment to get there, and be worrying about your dinner more than your performance. That's something I would say. Just pick your battles and do it in the off season. Do it in the off season. Make those good decisions, make those ethical decisions, but don't go down the rabbit hole saying it's a performance, because it doesn't stack up. It just, unfortunately, it doesn't as yet. I would say that would be my soapbox moment on that.
So when for vegetarians or vegans, they are obviously different levels of things that you need to do to make those different diets work. But I'm sure we have many listeners of both of those diets. So what would be some tips for each of them that you would say, other than having the flexible approach when it comes to racing and being abroad and so on, but in the day-to-day, are there any other things that come up when you're working with clients with those diets?
I would say, regular blood testing is something that's really important, because you're excluding, some pretty chunky food groups there. I would say just be aware that I would maybe just build into your planning that I would be looking at having regular blood tests, because the problem now, I take you to a supermarket. This is one of the things I love to do. I'd love to, if you're ever in the UK, I'd love to take you to a supermarket and just walk around. I've done this with some of the athletes, go, well, 90% of that stuff is absolute garbage. That is not for you. So if I took you to the vegan section now, you've got this fake meat, you've got all these, you can have everything, fake bacon. What's in it? And if you look at the back of these packets, you go, Jesus Christ, what is this? And there's this cornucopia of chemicals. The other one that's in a lot of these products is pea protein. Pea protein's never batch tested. So you go back to your, failing the drugs test. And this was it was a BC rider that told me about pea protein. I didn't know this. It's probably about 3 years ago she told me. Pea protein, mate, that again could fail you a test. Is just get your protein sources as varied as you can, mix it up, get regular blood tests, and supplementation is something, again, you maybe want to look down, but it's a very individual basis because it's going to depend on the athlete. And I think that's something that's really, really important. But regular blood testing is probably the main thing. There's experts
how often would that be? 4 times a year, 2 times a year?
I would say 3 times, 3-4 times a year, every 3 months. Like there's very good companies. There's certainly one in the UK called Fourth Edge that do a subscription blood testing service, which will give you all the metrics you need. The other one that we didn't talk, and again, there's experts out in there. I'm not an expert in this because I don't pretend to be, because I don't go down this route. If somebody comes to me and says, we do have some clients who are vegetarian and we have some clients who are vegan, it's just the caveat is, look, just be careful. That would be it. The other ones we haven't talked about, I put it down on a little list, is the low carb thing and this fasted diet that a lot of people go on. Low carb is something, again, I would often be careful of, because what people are doing is they're putting their body under stress unnecessarily, and it'll come down to, it's a way of losing weight. Reduce the amount of carbohydrate, by default, you're going to lose weight. You're creating a deficit. I'd be really careful with it. And also fasted training, when essentially you're taking a meal. If you speak to a lot of coaches of that, you have to be so careful, again, because you're putting your body under a lot of stress. So for the listeners out there that don't know how this would work, what people would suggest maybe is you do a hard session in the evening. Your meal afterwards would be purely protein. You would then go out in the morning off the back of a black coffee, and you'd do anything between an hour to 90 minutes fasted, just with water, and then you would fuel normally. The problem with that, firstly, I'm terrible at it because I get grumpy. If I'm hungry, I get really angry, and I'm not a nice person to be around. So any benefit's negated. But I think the stresses you potentially put on your body, I don't get the benefit. I don't get the benefit versus reward. I don't get. And I don't know, you read about this stuff all the time, and I always think, if I was going to do 10 things, that would be so far off the bottom of my list, it would be not true. The other diet that we do use and we practice, and I'm a huge fan of, is a low res or low fiber diet before races. Probably quite useful for athletes that you're working with, because predominantly they're doing single events. This is something I first became aware of back in 2012. Wiggins was doing it when he won the Tour de France. And essentially what you're doing before key events is you're reducing the amount of fiber in your diet. Your body can theoretically have up to 2 kilos of undigested fiber in the gut. And if you take fiber out, so fiber's in all the healthy foods that you have on a day-to-day basis, so fruit, veg, nuts, seeds, grains, they all contain fiber. So if you can reduce the amount of fiber and essentially flush yourself out, first of all, you've got a weight benefit. There can be a bit of water retention, and you just feel kind of ready. We tested it with a group of World Tour riders with Canyon SRAM last year. I'm not breaking any confidentiality by saying this. And we had, I think, 14 riders at a training camp. And we took fiber out of the diet before they were doing some pretty hardcore testing. And out of the 14 riders, I think 10 felt significant benefits from reducing the amount of fiber. So what the protocol would be from that is 48 hours prior from event, you'd have, say, rice, white rice, porridge. For breakfast, you'd have, say, rice noodles, white rice noodles with grilled salmon, sweet chili salmon for lunch. And then your main meal could be rice-based pasta, which is gluten-free pasta, grilled zucchini, courgette, that's low in fiber, chicken, a basic tomato sauce, like a passata sauce, is fairly low in fiber. And then your dessert would be watermelon, because watermelon is low in fiber, honey and Greek yogurt. So you're getting carbs, you're getting protein. And if you repeat that for 2 days, it makes a massive difference. And you guys, well, what difference does it make? Trial it and see. Into context, wheat pasta versus white rice. Wheat pasta has predominantly got 12 grams of fiber per 100 grams versus almost none in white rice. So it's taking all the good stuff out of your diet. So low fiber diet, huge fan for maybe 2 days. I have heard of World Tour teams that are doing it for stage races. It's not healthy. You'll go well off it, but it's not for long-term health. But if you've got a key event, try a low-fiber diet for 2 days. Low res, low fiber, call it what you want. That works, in my humble opinion. You feel ready.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I generally, at latest the day before the race, I would say the 2 days before the race, I do decrease fiber, especially the day before. I try to really minimize it. And veggies and so on. The 2 days before, I would remove or at least minimize. But I haven't really done it as systematically or with completely or eliminating as much as possible. So that would be interesting to try.
It works. We've done it with a number of athletes, and it works. And even water retention. We had one athlete I worked with who was really bad at needing to pee when they were on the bike, like really bad, like 20 minutes in, 40 minutes in, and that almost went. That almost disappeared. But also from a weight perspective, that I personally will do it even before a 10-mile time trial. I can lose 1.5 kilos, even if I'm in shape, and be carved up to the eyeballs, be absolutely pinging with it. So I think it's worth trying. And if you're away, again, people go, how do I do it when I'm away? Get a little rice cooker. You can do it all in a rice cooker. So white rice, like risotto rice. So the breakfast that I love is to use risotto rice, white sugar, and then light coconut milk. Bang that in a rice cooker, high in carbs, loads of fat, and just easy to digest. Some vanilla and cinnamon in there to get it to taste real good. And then you're going. And then rice noodles is another one. So again, what I try and do, Michael, is I try and make sure that we're talking about foods that you can buy anywhere in the world. So if I'm in America or I'm in Czech Republic or I'm in France or Spain, you can go to an Aldi, you can pick up rice noodles, you can pick up white rice, you can pick up coconut milk. We're not talking about organic kale here. We're talking about stuff you can pick up everywhere. And if you try that, jobs are good in. And even something as simple as using gluten-free flour, you tick in the gluten-free box, gluten-free pasta is invariably made from rice. So by default, it's lower in fiber.
Yeah, that's interesting. The day before the race, especially, what I've been doing is to, eat like normal meals, like with rice and tomato sauce, or maybe chicken or something. But the large amount of carbohydrates that I want to get in, like getting to that 10 to 12 grams per kilo for the day, I get in from just pure maltodextrin and fructose. So drinking it, essentially liquid carbs. And that's something that I found works well for me, because it's a lot of eating to be eating 10 to 12 grams of carbohydrates if you eat all of it.
It's hard going. And the thing is, I've heard athletes say, I don't like it. Listen, you're not going at afternoon tea to the Ritz. It's, this is the performance stage of it. Whereas, as soon as you finish, man, get all that healthy stuff down your neck. But when you come into it, just get as many pure carbs in as you can. And I think, that's the thing that I think is really important.
Yeah. But that's where what I was thinking about there as well is going back to the tracking, a period of time where I find it very useful to calculate exactly what you get in particular in terms of carbs, is the 2 days before a key race, because then that's when you start to realize how much you actually, or how difficult it actually is to get in even 7 to 8 grams per kilo body weight. I think a lot of athletes don't realize just how much carbohydrate that is. And then for a race, you try to get in 10 grams or 12 grams per kilo body weight. And that's a huge amount. And unless you're very deliberate about it, then you're not going to get it, I don't think. So that's an area where it's useful to track and at least once to get an idea for what you need to consume.
Exactly. And I think it's also athletes that are listening to this need to be aware they can train the gut to take on carbs. They can train the body to do it. And that's something, again, if you took a benchmark athlete who'd been predominantly under fueling and you suddenly start sticking in that amount of food into them or loading them up with 100 to 120 grams of carbs per hour, they're going to have some fairly unpleasant experiences coming along quite quickly. So I think it's something that they should look at the overall performance package, but don't become obsessed about it. Just let it build up. And that's why use your calendar. Just use your calendar. And I think keeping a journal is something that people just don't use enough. It doesn't cost anything. It's not shiny or sparkling, but how do you feel? And, when they're doing the post-race, diagnosis and they're looking at it going, well, what did I eat before and how did I feel and how were my energy levels? And so often that's just the missing part. I always refer to it as the performance jigsaw puzzle. We all know how the puzzle should look, but whether you put it together starting at the sides or in the middle or the top, however you put it together, just think about how do I put that puzzle together, because fueling is a big part of the puzzle. And I think, one of the things that I wanted to bring up as well is I'm fairly fortunate. We've been running this business for 10 years now. So I look at training plans from coaches all over the world and work in elite athletes and down to people who just want to get round. And it's also, I think, something that's really interesting to look at, Michael, is to look at like the habits of professional athletes and what can you learn from pros? Because the problem is that professional athletes are up there and they're promoting the brands and the products and what they're doing. And as amateurs, all they're doing is they're looking through there. They've got that keyhole. They're just doing that. And they're seeing that one thing that's the here and now. And they're not looking over the big thing. And I think, if we look at, say, the bad stuff, and let's start negative. I generally try not to be negative when I'm talking on any form of platform or whatever. And if you look at the negative stuff that you can learn from pro sport, because I think there's a lot to be learned, is that chasing excellence is something that professional athletes do. It's something that they do, but they've got an infrastructure that's around them. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, I've worked in a couple of high-performing environments like Michelin star cooking and elite sport and all that. To become excellent at anything requires obsessive behavior. That's a fact. Nobody comes world-class at anything by being ambiguous or being beige. Beige doesn't create excellence. The problem with that is if you then, because we're talking about food, if you apply that to food, you can end up going down a rabbit hole. So if you ever get to the point that you're weighing your food or you're worrying about food, and you should seek professional advice. Now, professional advice is not Instagram. Let's just factually put that out there, right? Social media is not professional advice, okay? Social media is worth what you pay for it, which is nothing, okay? So if it's for free, that's what it's worth. It's not worth a thing. There's some brilliant sports scientists out there, some brilliant practitioners. Personal favorite, there's a lady in the UK called Renee McGregor, who wrote a brilliant book called Orthorexia about the cult of clean eating and how, if you think, well, I'm doing this at this level, if I just double this, I'll become just so much better. And that's something that you have to be aware of in elite sport, is that generally these people will have psychologists, they'll have physiologists, they'll have nutritionists, they'll have dietitians, they'll have every metric measured. That is almost impossible for 95% of your listeners to achieve. So be aware of excellence and just be aware of obsessiveness. You do it. You start weighing stuff and you start worrying about your food too much, or you start looking at labels too much, just take a step back, buy Orthorexia, it's on Amazon, it costs nothing. It's the best 10 quid you'll ever see. The other one, I think, and we touched on it earlier, metrics is measuring metrics. Now, I'm not a nerd. I'm not a particular nerd, but I think weight and body fat percentage is probably the metric that most people should be least concerned about. I've never seen anybody's body fat percentage on a result sheet, any more than I've ever seen anybody's watts per kilo on the result sheet. It's irrelevant. And I would say, again, you look at these amazing examples of athletes that are out there, and I think it borderlines. There's disordered eating across the board, and I think it's something that there's been two cases of lately. And again, my attitude, and you need to stop me, Michael, if I'm talking out of hand here. I generally don't use social media or any platform to talk badly about other people. I think if you've got nothing nice to say, then you shouldn't say it at all. But there's a couple of cases of late that struck out to me that I thought were reckless, talking about body fat percentage and weight, because I think what you've got to look at is anybody who's in the public eye that's a professional athlete. As a professional athlete, you've almost got a duty of care to the people that are looking at you. There's sponsors, there's young athletes that look up to you. There's people that don't actually understand the requirements of elite athletes. And I think when people start talking about the body fat percentage and their weight, that's such an unimportant measurement when it comes to performance. I just think it's almost the least relevant, because you and I know if you're going to have an athlete, and that matter whether it's Michael who wants to qualify for World 70.3 or somebody that wants to win the Olympics, the main thing that they're going to do is be able to absorb a high training volume, training load, and consistency. Consistency. If you are constantly depleted, or you are operating at such a low body fat percentage that you're not robust, you're not able to absorb the training, you're not able to recover, you're not able to go out day after day, you're never going to achieve your goals. It doesn't matter whether you're Michael that works in an office or you're winning your third Olympics on the bounce. It ain't going to happen. And the two cases I want to talk about lately, there was a husband of a very famous athlete who said, I'm at a race, I'm 4% body fat, more than anybody that's racing here. What relevance is that of anything? You telling me that Christian Blumenfeld has stood on the start line and he's measuring his body fat? Nah, he's looked at how many hours he's logged. Yeah, it is completely and utterly irrelevant. And I just think that associating your body fat percentage with success, what the success look like, is dangerous. I think it's irrelevant, to be perfectly honest, for most athletes. And then there was another one that absolutely killed me. That there was again, I'm not going to name names. It was an athlete who's had a phenomenal season, won multiple big races. And they put out on social media, now bear in mind on Instagram, this athlete's got over 500,000 followers, all right? That's a big reach, that they'd lost 3.5 kilos and they're now ready to race. Now, I'm guesstimating that's probably 6 to 8% of this athlete's body weight. That's what they'd lost. So they'd associated losing 3.5 kilos as being ready to race. That's reckless. That's absolutely reckless. And at that point, the sponsors of that athlete want to get on the phone and say, hey, this kid's looking at this. There's athletes looking at this. That is dangerous. Now, this athlete might have done it correctly. They might have been doing it for 10 years. They might have measured it. But that was the headline news for it. I just think but you also then look at the top end of the sport, the PTO, right? So PTO have done some brilliant things. They put on races during lockdown. They've got, athlete welfare at the forefront. There's maternity pay. There's all sorts of stuff going on. You and I, Michael, we're sat on our sofa with our Big Mac, relaxing, and we are watching a PTO race. What flashes up? This athlete, and what's a metric that they've got on the athlete as it comes up on the screen? The athlete's weight.
Yeah.
Seriously. The athletes, they want to say, oi, why is my weight on there? Because it's not a measurement of me as a person. It's not a measurement of my shape. And if you go onto PTO website, which I did the other day, just to make sure I knew what I was talking about, there's only 3 female athletes in the top 10 that actually don't have their weight on the PTO website. Do you know who they are? the three best performing athletes. Well, not, you could say Ashley Gentle's got hers on there and she's been amazing. So, and I'm not divulging. Kat Matthews, who for me, if she hadn't had her accident, would have won Kona. Chelsea Sodaro and Taylor Knibb haven't got the weight on there. Why have the rest of them got on there? If somebody from the PTO asked me my weight, I'd say, why? It's not a judgment of where I am. So I think that is something that's really dangerous in elite sport. And I said, if you're looking into it, honestly, I would be more concerned about how many sessions in your 12, 14, 16-week training block did you fuel correctly? How many hours sleep did you get? How many hours did you spend training in position? How many swim drills you do? Any metric you want, but going on, you've lost X amount of kilos, you're ready to race, or you're at 6% body fat. Seriously, do yourself a favor and don't worry about it. That's dangerous. And that's something that is a bad thing about elite sport. There's an obsession with weight. And I just think that. And if you look at it, the reason I'll say this, if you look at any world-class endurance event, and you obviously watch a lot of sport, you're well-read, it's divided into thirds, all right? There's thirds. And you look at this and you'll say, this is right. There'll be a third that will turn up undercooked. Basically, they're injured, they've not been able to do the training, the body's broken down, and they shouldn't be there. But they're going to get
overcooked, right?
Undercooked.
Okay.
They've not done the work. They've said, right, I'm going to do the under. So there's a third under, there's a third over. All right? There's a third over who have done too much. They've been chasing that elusive 35-hour weeks. They've done too much. They've not rested enough. Now, both of them, food plays a huge part in it. All right, because you can become injured because you're maybe depleted or you haven't eaten properly. That's going to affect your health and well-being. And they'll be overcooked as well. They've just done too much and they've burnt themselves out. And there's a third actually race. So if you look at Kona, look at the elite field. How many actually race it? A third. If you're lucky, there's only ever a third. And you want to be in that third. You don't want to be in the third that's over or under. So that's why I think it's really important that you look at your training load. And elite athletes always post these amazing numbers and everything else. But if you look at how many of them actually ever compete at the sharp end, it's probably no more than a third. Look at London Marathon. Look at Olympic Marathon. Look at Olympic 10,000 meters. Any endurance event you like, there's a third race it. Ask yourself why. And it's either over or undercooked. So I think that's something that's really, really important. And the training load that a lot of elite athletes will operate on, they've got to remember that if you'll know this, world-class swimmers, unless you're swimming competitively by the age of, 8, you're never going to be a world-class swimmer. If you look at any endurance sport, the chances are they've been doing it for a long period of time. They've built up a huge base. It's not like they've just suddenly come into money or their life's changed and they're going to take up elite sport. They've been doing it for a long time. So the load and the intensity at which they operate is a completely different level to what amateur athletes were. Don't try and copy that. Because, again, I don't know what your biggest hours week. So I've done 35 hours in a week before. And, mate, I've not been able to get out of bed the following week. So I think just be aware of following the load, etc., that elite athletes do. There's a reason they do that, and it's a reason they're world class. And if you try and copy that, you can end up with issues. So I would say those are the bad things. Have you got any other bad?
I'll just jump in there because this is something the listeners won't know, but we actually had a chat where we planned this interview a bit and went through some things. And we talked about this for a long time, actually, the social media. And, at least I recognize at least the first post that you mentioned there. And I actually went and commented on it because I thought it was so horrendous. I didn't see the other ones, but I have commented on other posts or sent messages and things when I think people are out of line with that. And I do agree, like it's really it's really dangerous and really poor judgment from athletes that post those kinds of things.
Exactly. There's nothing to be gained from it. There's absolutely nothing to be gained from it. There's no possible benefits from doing that. And I think that's something it's hugely dangerous. It's dangerous and destructive. And I've heard horror stories about stuff in the past of athletes being told to lose weight or comments. And I think the famous one, again, is that somebody made the comment that Kat Matthews didn't look like a runner. And I remember sending her a message and go, well, what does a runner look like? And I'm sure Nicholas Spurrig thinks Kat Matthews looks like a runner, but it's just like, who, seriously, like, come on. Like, come on, it's dangerous. But no, it's something. I think
there's a lot of ignorance in the sport, and even at a coaching level, I think there's a lot of ignorance. And I've heard a lot of stories, and I think I may be wrong, but I think it's more prevalent in triathlon on the short course triathlon circuit than long course.
Yeah.
And but I would be curious actually to hear your perspective on that, because from my perspective as a coach and for us as a coaching business, we get a lot of athletes to us that have done some sort of, they maybe have been doing on a low carb, high fat diet or something, and they're burnt out from that, and they come to us to try to sort things out, or they have had some sort of just simply like maybe an eating disorder or just under fueling. That's very common that we get athletes that try to sort out their training and racing, and one of the main reasons that they are in a mess is one of those reasons. Those are being very common factors. But you working directly with nutrition and food, I bet for you see that even more clearly if that is the case. Like, do you get lots of athletes coming to you that come to you with that direct history of issues?
Yes, we do. Now, I've got to the stage in my life, Michael, that I don't beat about the bush. So if somebody's come to me and I genuinely think they've got an issue, I'm not qualified to deal with that. It's not my role to do that. So I would always put them to a professional. Alternatively, if somebody tells me that they're a certain weight and they only eat a certain amount of food, I'll say, seriously? Come on, let's do the maths on this. You know, if they are overweight and they want to lose, and they say, well, they're only having 1,500 calories a day. And I say, well, and you're doing, 3 hours a day? And that doesn't add up. So we do get it occasionally. And sometimes it's a matter of some tough love and just say, look, that isn't the case. Or alternatively, if somebody's got some acute behavior, I'll put them down the route of some healthcare professionals that I know. So it's something that's really, really common. It is really common. Generally, I would see maybe 1 or 2 cases a month that people will approach us thinking that we're just going to be a quick fix, that you just tell them to eat X, Y, and Z. But a lot of it's quite often it's deep rooted. But if you think about how we view our self-worth these days through social media, etc., that's why I worry about future generations, because they're judging their self-worth on this. And your self-worth has got nothing to do with this. And, I've got teenage daughters. It's the same thing, but it's quite a scary place. So what you're telling me about people who've gone on these fuddy diets, I can tell you categorically that the best athletes in the world don't go on fuddy diets. They eat everything. They eat it in balance and moderation. Fact. That's it. They're not depleting themselves of anything. And the ones that are maybe got that, maybe it's insecurity, or maybe it's a cry for help, or I'm not qualified to say, but all I'll say is that those issues are very easy to spot when, there's a couple of cases recently I've refused to work with certain people and until they've got professional help, and I'll put them to the right people that can deal with that. So it's scary, but professional sport has to take an accountability. PTO, why the hell have we got the athlete's weight? First and foremost, why? I don't understand why it's there. It makes it interesting. Well, this athlete's X, Y, Z. But if you look at it, if you looked at the metrics, you would suggest that nobody can be successful in long course triathlon as a female athlete unless they're 50 odd kilos. That's what it would suggest. And if you're not, you might as well not bother. Or because all the top athletes are 50 something kilos. I know for a fact that top athletes aren't 57 kilos. That is not a metric for excellence. It's not at all. And the other one, while we're on a rant about professional sport, the other one as well, I think you have to be a little bit aware of with practitioners in sport. Certainly people who've been to university, or these clever nerds that are just purely looking at metrics. This is a human sport. It's about people, and your ability to get on in life. You as a coaching business will be, if you're not empathetic and you don't understand the people, then you'll never actually cultivate great coaching or great people. And it used to crack me up that we'd have these amazing sports scientists, and I used to fall out with them because they'd never look at the humans. They'd never look at the athlete. They'd look at the white of their eyes. They'd look at the morale of that athlete. And I think it's something, again, to be a little bit careful of. If, say, a sports scientist is just giving an athlete macros, for example, right, this is what your macro or your calorie count has to be a day. They're not looking at the person. And I think that's something that we lose track of these days, and remote everything and just looking at athletes' metrics without looking at the human behind it. And there was one particular example we had, and we were a year out from the Olympics, the first Olympics, the 2020, not the 2021. And we were on a training camp in Portugal with a male endurance squad for British cycling. So these are all the guys that are going to Olympics to win medals. And the weather was shit. It was like Portugal, and it rained for 10 days. And on the second last day, the guys were doing double days. So they were doing big endurance blocks and doing gym, filthy training it was. And on the second last day, I'd been out with the guys, and they'd been out and they'd done 6 hours with 2,500 meters of climbing in the rain, right? That was day 9 of riding in the rain. And we had a meal plan, which we always did for the ordering, which I always ran by a nutritionist. And the guys were broken. So I did them this pasta bake with cheese and bacon, and did them like sweet potato brownies or like vanilla yogurt and everything, because they were broken. They were absolutely broken. I had a phone call from Manchester from this guy. He goes, what's on the meal plan? I said, well, this, but I changed it. They go, why did you change it? I said, do you want to see the guys? They've done 6 hours in the rain. This is, they're broken. And I said, so I can give them grilled chicken with green vegetables and white rice, but what will happen is half an hour later, they're going to be in the Soignier's room having Haribo and Pringles and sugary cereal. So let's look at the morale of the athlete. And it's something I think is quite often missing in academics or professionals, that if they haven't been there or walked the walk, and I'm not just saying the best athletes make the best coaches, the best practitioners, because they don't. But I just say sometimes you have to look at the human element of it. And quite often it's all about numbers and X, Y, and Z. Look at the human. And again, you have to do it as a coach, because if you're setting somebody an unrealistic plan of you need to do X, Y, or Z hours, and you think, well, they've got 2 young kids, or they've got a job, or this woman's just moved jobs, or they moved house, or whatever. How are they ever going to do it? And I think that human element is something, again, professional athletes invariably will only have one thing to worry about, is their performance. They won't be worrying about other stuff. So just take any advice you get in that sphere with a little bit of a pinch of salt, because quite often it's not all about the metrics, it's about the human. And a happy athlete will be a good performing athlete. And if you're trying to get them to do something that's not going to make them happy, then quite often you're not going to get the best outcome. And I've seen that. I've had a few, let's say, challenges with professionals in elite sport because of that. They've just been looking at metrics and not looking at the guys who are broken.
Yeah, it's probably the best advice that I ever received as a coach, and that I've ever given from I got it first and gave it later, but people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
I like that. I like that. That's good. Well, I used to ride with the guys a lot, because, with a truck, certainly the pursuit guys, if you're reasonably fit, you could hang on the wheels, okay, and you go out, or you'd look at the dinner table and they'd be quiet. And a quiet dinner table is either they're blown away with the food or they're broken. And if you were doing constant 10-day camps in the rain, and you just got to look at the morale of those athletes, and it's something and it's also having that empathy. And I think I remember I'm good mates with Dan Bigham, and I remember he was talking recently on one of the many podcasts he was on about, with him going into Ineos, because he competes with the guys on a level. He's got an in. He's got a lot more acceptability, and because you ride yourself and you've been reasonable at sport yourself, there's almost an acceptability. You know what you're talking about. You might not, but I think if you've done 6 hours in the rain, you don't want grilled chicken and white rice. I'll tell you that for a fact.
Yeah.
Good. Right.
I want to comment on that training camp. One more thing, because we're actually running a training camp in Portugal this January, and I know where you were. You were in Miranda do Corvo, which is in the center of the country.
Yeah.
We're going to go to the Algarve, where the weather is a lot nicer, so we won't have 10 days of rain.
I love it. That's Michael's sales pitch for his Algarve.
The camp is actually sold out already, but it's just not to scare the people that are registered for it.
No, Miranda do Corvo was good, because we had a very quiet training base, and we had a gym, because the track guys do a lot of gym work, and we had a gym, and it was good. It was a good place to be, but we used to occasionally get these blocks. Didn't happen often, but you get 10 days of rain, which was savage. So that's the negative stuff, I think, about the elite athletes. And then I think it's also good to look at the good stuff. And it was something you touched on earlier. I think elite athletes are very athletically self-aware. They know what works for them, and they're not afraid to do what works for them. And I think that's something that's very difficult for certainly athletes that are new to the sport or haven't been in the sport for a long period of time, which invariably are athletes that want coaching and nutrition advice, so people that you and I work with. So I'd say, if you look at, say, the top of the performance pyramid, if you look at, say, I'm going to use two names which are relevant, which are obviously very different. If you look at Christian Blumenfeld and Jan Frodeno, both won Olympic short course or Olympic triathlon, and both won Ironman World Championships. you couldn't get two more different specimens, physical specimens. Now, if Christian suddenly decided he wanted to look like Jan, I think Christian's performance might go off a cliff. And also, if Jan decided he wanted to look like Christian, that might be quite an odd thing as well. So I think those two athletes are very athletically self-aware. And you look at Christian's training methods about the science, and they take himself off to altitude and do all the Christian Blumenfeld stuff. That's very different from Jan, living with his family, having a very small training group. And just, you speak to Jan and he talks about meat and potatoes, just does the basics really well. And he'll go to a swimming pool, and I've done some work with Jan. Jan's a great guy, and he'll go to a pool and he'll get in and he'll be doing his swim session, and 2 lanes across will be his training partner, and there'll be some guy doing breaststroke. Don't care, don't bother him at all. And he'll go out, he'll do the same 4 rides, he'll do kilometre intervals around an industrial estate in Girona. He does meat and potatoes, and he's found out what works for him. So I think that being athletically self-aware about what works for you is something that is really important. And a lot of professional athletes know. They won't necessarily monkey see, monkey do. This person's doing that. They'll find out what works for them. And I would say that's a great bit of advice for what you're going to do. And I would say the other one as well is identifying key races and practicing for them, because so much of it is what happens. And we've had a couple of clients who, one guy in particular, he lives in Wales in the UK. It's cold, it's wet, and his key races every year in Central Europe. And I'm like, why do you think you're going to go well in 35 degrees when you live in one of the coldest, wettest places in the UK? Also, make sure that you identify what success looks like for you as an athlete. And I think that's something that's really, really important, because the behaviors and the habits around how you operate, and I'm using this from a food perspective, but training and a level of commitment or investment. I don't like sacrifice because they're not in a war zone. You know what I mean? It's investment. It's personal investment in it, is applicable to what success looks like. And if you're looking to finish a race, or you're wanting to qualify for age group, or you want to win age group, or you want to become a professional that survives, or it's winning multiple world and Olympic championships, those are very, very different. So I think it's really important that you identify what success looks like. And professional athletes are very, very good at doing that. Like, I've worked with athletes that an Olympic silver medal, it's an absolute disaster. I've worked with people who they just want to finish, and that they get as much of a buzz out of it. And then there's a great sports psychologist in the UK, a woman called Dr. Josie Perry, and we've done some work with her and clients, and she's got this great kind of mantra. I'm going to get the words wrong, but she says, you identify what the goal is, and then you create habits around those goals, and you work out where you are. So again, if Michael wants to qualify for World 70.3, what are the habits and behaviors of that person, and how many of them are you doing them, and then reassess it. And I think pros are very good at identifying what success looks like, and they're not deluded. Like, again, if qualifying for Kona as a pro, that's your goal, brilliant. But that shouldn't be, say, the ambition of Daniela Riff or Lucy Charles or Kat Matthews. It's not, and the behavior is adapted accordingly. And I think that's something, we talk about fueling and everything else. If you say you need to ride a 4-hour bike split, work out what that looks like. Work out what your CDA means, what your CDA means to you, what your fueling does, and practice it in training, and just get those habits. Those are good habits. And I think it's really important with that. I've got 2 examples that I'm going to talk about with that, about practicing for the events and identifying what success looks like. And they're 2 quite good ones for a little bit of research. So the one's a few years ago, and they're both cycling related, because cycling is very easy to track metrics. So a few years ago, Chris Froome was wanting to try and win the Giro, the Vuelta, and the Tour all in the same year. So that was what success looked like for him. And he, in January, was on, I've actually written this down, because it's difficult numbers. January 2018, and you'll know this from a coach perspective, Chris Froome went out and did this famous ride that was on Strava called Emptying the Tank. Now get your head around this. He did 270K, right, at 44.8 kilometers an hour with 3,500 meters of climbing. Right? That's a big deal on the bike. Now, what he'd also done, sandwiched between that day, is he'd done 300K either side of it. So 160 and 140K. So he went out and he did that. Now, as a coach, is there any physiological benefit of doing that at the start of January for a race in May? And the answer is no, because you can't keep falling that long. What the hell are you doing that for? What Froome was doing was he was training his gut to absorb high-dose carbohydrate under stress while fatigued. So he was looking at where the demands of events was, and he was practicing it from a fueling perspective. If you then go to May 2018, stage 19 of the Giro. Amazing attack, old school attack. Froome went to attack, 3 weeks in, 19 days, not quite 3 weeks, but you get what I'm meaning. Fatigued, and he went to the front and he attacked with 80k to go. Look at his bike. Look what he's got on his bike. He's got one bottle. Like, who the hell attacks with 80k to go, one bottle? But he knew he'd trained his gut to take on 80 to 100 grams of carbs per hour, and he had an hour full gas. And he knew he could do it. And they also had people to give him bottles all the way around. So when his competitors were going, oh, shit, what do we do? Froome's got him. He was away. And he knew that he could take on that amount of carbohydrate under stress while fatigued. And if you want to see, well, what relevance is this in triathlon? Look at when the wheels come off. Look at the last 20k of Kona. Any year you like, doesn't matter what year it is, and you'll see these amazing athletes that are look like they're sculpted out of stone, that are stood by the side of the road. Literally, their body isn't able to take on sports nutrition product because they've not trained their body for the demands of the event. It's as simple as that. They've done the hours, they've done the underpants run, they look great, but they've not trained the body to take on fuel under load. That's it. There's no other reason for it because they've done the work to get there, but have they trained their body to take on carbs after 9 hours? My guess is not. That's why they're doing it. So that's one very good example of a professional athlete that trains for the demands of the event well in advance. There's another one, which again, and I'm looking at the opposite end of the spectrum about an athlete who actually adapted to the conditions and used the fueling. In this year, the World Cyclocross Championships was in Arkansas. It was in America, and it was unseasonably warm. It was in the 20 degrees. Now, if you think about cyclocross, for those that don't know about cyclocross is a very European sport. It's predominantly in northern Europe, as in Belgium and France, and it's usually in pretty inclement conditions. This is cyclocross season, November, December, January, February. So it's normally really cold conditions, really horrible wet conditions. And the races are normally between 50 minutes and an hour long. That's what it is, full gas. This year, the greatest cyclist currently, I would say, you could argue ever, Marianne Vos was racing the women's race. And you think it's 50 minutes, full gas. I think her race was 55 minutes. And Marianne Vos did something that nobody else did. First of all, she won, which nobody else did. But she had a bottle on her bike. She had a bottle. She had a bead on, a 500ml bead on. And what happened was every time she got to start finish straight, she took a drink of her bottle and looked at her main competitor, Lucinda Brand. So it's 20 plus degrees. And she's doing an hour of over-unders, full gas efforts. Would you ever, ask yourself this as an athlete, would you ever do an hour of full gas intervals without taking a drink? Carbs?
Absolutely not.
Never.
I wouldn't do a 30-minute race without a bottle.
Exactly. But the culture in that sport was, well, we don't have a bottle, it's only a short race, why would we do it? She looked at the conditions, she adapted accordingly. Brilliant. Only person that did it. I worked with an athlete who was in the top 10. I asked her, was she thirsty? She goes, yeah, I was thirsty after 20 minutes. Okay, what would DeVos do? She adapted accordingly. But the brilliant thing, this is the brilliant thing, and you love it. So you are watching the most prolific winning athlete that's currently in the pro peloton, male or female, by some margin. All the men are watching this. It's on a Saturday. On the Sunday, how many of them had a bottle on the bike? One. The person that won it, Tom Pidcock. He's the only one that had a bottle. So you always say, but they're the best in the world. And why are they the best in the world? Because they look at the details. So you think about Pidcock. So Pidcock's probably 50, 55 kilos dripping wet. He's putting like 600 grams on his bike. So he's putting a considerable amount on his bike because, and again, he did it. Every start finish straight, he took a drink. And I put a post out on this in February after the Worlds was on. And it was probably one of the most interactive posts. People, but they don't do that in cyclocross. Well, it's 20 odd degrees. Why would you not do it in circumstances? So I would say the two messages from that is as a professional, either practice for the event. So if your key event is Frankfurt in the middle of summer, it's going to be hot. Look at what it looks like, train your gut, do all the things you can, work out the amount of carbohydrate, be aware that taking solid fuel is going to raise your core temperature, it's harder to digest, and do that well in advance. And also make sure you've got that protocol in advance of what you're going to eat in the 24, 48 hours before. And then also don't be afraid to adapt to the conditions. Look at those two, whilst all your clients are doing winter training, go online and look at Froome, Stage 19 Giro, and look at the World Cyclocross Championships from last year. Every time, just a drink, every time they were doing it for an hour race. So if that's a sprint race or whether it's a 2 hour race, because a 1 hour, 2 hour, 4 hour, 8 hour race, they're going to have different requirements. But when you're doing your plan of what success looks like from a fueling perspective, that start that 5 months in advance and start practicing it. Even something as simple as you see it in the pro ranks. I saw Lucy Charles Barkley did it in one of the PTO races. She hadn't practiced putting a bottle in and out. In where the hell were they? Within Texas or some god awful place?
Dallas.
Dallas, Mike. Seriously, mate, I would be like, what? There's no reason for that. So again, if you got to think, every time you come up out your aero position, it's going to cost you 50 watts. Practice. Practice having your bottle whilst you're in aero position. Practice taking on gels. Practice that hours in advance. And I think that's something that's really, really important. And make sure that that's as part of your protocol as anything else. And the 24, 48 hours prior to a race, make sure you've got it all sorted. The reason I'd say that, if Michael, you go to your World 70.3 and you've managed to qualify, and the night before I say, right, there's a new bike, it's free. I'm going to give you a pair of running shoes, they're free, but they're slightly too small, and I'm going to give you a new saddle, it's free. Would you use that saddle and new shoes? Never. But people do it with food.
Yeah.
I'll go to a hotel buffet, just practice it. And I'd say that's one of the things I would say that elite athletes are very good at. They know what success looks like, so some of them having a contract, getting paid, great. You do the same thing and write it down. Just write it down on a piece of paper and then say, okay, well, what habits does age group winner, age group qualifier, finisher, what habits do they have? And then apply that logic to food. So if you need to be able to, and then just keep going back to it, revisit, set yourself a reminder that every 4 weeks, go back and say, okay, well, of these habits around your food, your fueling, how many of these sessions did I train at a gram of carbohydrate per kilo of body weight per hour? How many did I practice in my aero position drinking? And do it. And that's something I think is under sort of emphasized with athletes, but pros do it all the time. They'll go out and they'll train in position. And you might go, it's bloody expensive, because a bottle of carb drink's £4. Listen,
but it's not. It's not maltodextrin, fructose. It's dirt cheap, and you just mix up your own drink.
Absolutely, it can be as cheap, it can be as complicated, or it can be as easy as you want to make it. But it's just giving yourself a chance of success. And if success is getting round, cool, get round. But don't then be pissed off with yourself or your coach or your team around you if you don't achieve success, because food and fueling, basically Ironman is an eating competition. That's it. That's what it is. You've got to be able to eat under stress. If you can't eat in the lead up and during the event, you're never going to achieve your goals. And if you look at it now, one of the things I found Kona a bit unremarkable this year. I've got to be honest, the men's race I found unremarkable because I was blown away that they were looking at their watches and they're taking Super Sapiens to work out when they're drinking. I quite like the fact that you were watching the wheels come off when people drop bottles. But if you look at that control and you look at how metronomic the performances were, it's a fueling competition.
Yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying. I think unremarkable is maybe the wrong word when 4 people obliterated the previous course record. So.
I'm being unkind. I thought it was predictable. Predictable is probably a slightly nicer way of saying unremarkable. I thought that's what I personally thought, because you just knew it was going to happen. It was good conditions. You looked at the prep the guys had done and you thought, nah, it's predictable. And predictability in sport is, it's great for the athletes. It's not great when you're sat on the sofa. So, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. I think, on Kona, when you said that when you see these great athletes on the side of the road and they just can't keep running, I think there's a part of that's nutrition, but I also think that in that particular race, part of it is just pacing. And it might be in some cases, or in some cases, it certainly is that the athletes, they just execute poorly. They don't stick to their plan, or their plan was not good in the first place. But it can also be sometimes in that race, it's very expensive to get there. Only the top 15 get paid. They have to take a chance. And on a really good day, they can maybe sneak into the top 5 or top 10 or podium and get a payday. But then if it doesn't work out, then they're standing on the side of the road. So I think there are some race dynamics to that race, that it's not just about the nutrition when you see it.
Well, it's also, you look at it and there's been a lot of stuff documented, theoretically, if you're going to do it well, you need a month, 6 weeks, somewhere nice and replicating conditions. That's something that's very difficult to do. And yourself, if you lose that pace line, if you can't see the guys up the road, what price? And there's very few people who will let a pace line go. But if they're not training, for example, if they're used to doing 180k at 300 watts and suddenly they've got to ride at 320 watts, what's the carbohydrate requirement required to do an extra 8%? Is huge, or 10%, and they can cover those breaks, but all they're doing is they're burning matches, and it's a difficult race, and it's also difficult to predict. But if you go back to your thirds of undercooked, overcooked, and actually people that race it, it's the same. Like if you went through the finishing list there, you'd say, okay, well, who got this wrong and why? And that's what's fascinating about it. You don't, like the men's race, you could have predicted a bit. Like I didn't think Christian was going to win. I don't know why. I don't know why, but I thought it was fairly predictable. But yeah, I get it. If I was there, I'd go for it. I'd rather have a crack at it.
Yeah.
But then you also look at the pressures, and there was now they've got so much media and everything to do, and they're all sitting around chatting and doing all this stuff for sponsors. And I've seen it myself this year that we've had athletes underperform because of I think personally because of the requirements put onto them to be busy. So anyway.
Yeah. I have one question that I want to get to, and then we can start to wrap up. But we talked about here, you talked about what amateurs can learn from pros, so it's not exactly differences. But a difference question that I have is, are there any differences that you see between males and females, perhaps as it pertains to the different phases of the menstrual cycle, or any other differences that you think are worth talking about?
The menstrual cycle and the hormones is really difficult, and I know some athletes suffer terribly with it. Firstly, it's always been difficult because the majority of practitioners, coaches that work in elite sport are predominantly men. It is what it is. I don't know why it is, especially cycling. It still seems to be very male dominated. That's really hard, especially for younger athletes. So if you imagine you're a younger athlete that's 19, 20, younger female athlete, and she's got to go to some 45-year-old Belgian dude and say, well, I don't want to go out today because I feel it's not quite right. That's really difficult. It's becoming much more acceptable. Unfortunately, there's still very little in the way of research and professionals working in that space. There's a really good app called Fitter Woman, FITR Woman, that is brilliant about tracking a cycle. And Stacey Sims has done some great stuff on females in sport and elite sport, which is great. And she's got a fantastic book called Roar, ROAR, which is available on Amazon, which is must reading for, I think, any athlete, because we've all got to have relationships with female athletes and females, and to give you an understanding, as boys, it's really easy. We just race and we've got no excuses. With the females, it can be really challenging, and obviously they can have requirements at certain times in their cycle, which can have huge impacts on performance. So Stacey Sims and Fitter Women are two things that are worth doing. The other thing as well is I think there's also a lot more pressure on female athletes to look and behave in a certain way, and when they're talking about the menstrual cycle, and it's really difficult. And even today, like I read there was an article with one of the British cycling sprinters who was talking about periods, and that's great. It was Sophie Capewell that was talking about it online, and it's getting coverage now. So I think it's something that's really important, and I try to have the elephant in the room out with any female athletes that I'm talking with. Are they tracking their cycle? Do they have any special requirements? And I think from your perspective as well, from a coach's perspective, theoretically, you should be able to, you should have the relationship with the athlete that they can tell you so you can adapt their training accordingly. So, there is a huge difference, and I think they've just got, but again, it's hugely individual, that some athletes are affected massively by it and others kind of manage it better, but they need to track it and they need to communicate with their team around them to help them best they can. In theory, there can be a carbohydrate requirement of up to 25% more at certain times. And I've worked with athletes that we've managed it really, really well, and they've performed at key events through sharing the right information at the time. But if you have the Fitter Women app and you listen to the podcast or read the book by Stacey Sims, but it's still not talked about that much, which is quite sad. But it's
so in practice, it's as you do it on a completely individual basis, though. Like you don't have a specific like formula per se. Like
no, just because of the way some athletes are affected by it. Some athletes are hugely affected, and others can manage it through ibuprofen and just increasing carbohydrate around certain times. Others are literally, you won't see them. So it's a very individual thing. And the other one I don't. Oh, sorry, Michael.
That's the issue I have with Roar, because I've read it, and I think it actually it sensationalizes things, or it doesn't sensationalize things. It generalizes things too much. Like it, and I don't know if Stacey seems, because I've interviewed her in the past as well. But I think as I've learned more and coached more female athletes, had these conversations, I've learned more and more that there's just no one way of doing it, and that's where maybe, to be honest, like I don't give those resources, even though I have those, I have knowledge about them. One resource that I think is great is Kelly McNulty has a podcast and an Instagram account, and she was a guest on the show, and she has a background in academia, but also is active in coaching. And I think her perspective on it is extremely sound. But it is, at the end of the day, that you're just adjusting for the individual, because the variation is so huge.
It's true. And the other thing as well, to be honest, like I think what Stacey did do was she brought the elephant to the front of the room.
Yes.
She brought it out that this was a valid topic for discussion, for research, for resource to be applied to. And it is huge. And it's also every individual athlete will have a relationship with you or I or whoever that may be. And they might not want to talk about it. They might be really uncomfortable to talk about it. So I think it's really difficult. I always bring it up with athletes and just say, look, do you track, and try and read the room best you possibly can with regards to, how comfortable or uncomfortable is the athlete about doing it. So I've got athletes I work with that don't want to discuss it. That just, and that's fair enough. It's really, it's a hugely personal thing. And then I've got other athletes that will come in and go, I've almost got, right, okay, there's too much information being shared here. You know what I mean? And I think it's a very individual thing. So I think we need to keep talking about it, and we need to have an open door policy. But I'm with you. I don't go too deep into it, because if the athlete needs to have bloods and needs to have some form of supplementation or whatever, that's not my area of expertise. If they say, look, I need to have, like, we've got one world-class athlete who says, look, I need to have X, Y, and Z in my diet for this period of time. Cool. I can make food taste good with these core ingredients in it. But again, it's such an individual thing. It's difficult. And it's also, I think, very difficult as a man trying to speak to women about it, because you can't understand how they're feeling. You can't put yourself in their shoes. It's, because it can be embarrassing, it can be uncomfortable, and it's not talked about. So it's a tricky subject, but yeah, there is a difference for sure. Yep. And we have to be very lucky, think ourselves very lucky. We don't have to worry about it personally.
Yep. So let's start to wrap up. And if you could leave the listeners, and let's do this as a brief summary or brief takeaways, 1 to 3 brief takeaways from today's interview that you want to leave the listeners with, because we've been going for a long time.
I love it. Do you know what? I was listening to one of your podcasts the other day. I thought you were with Tipper, and I know Tipper from years ago. And you had a 2-part with Tipper, and I was laughing. I thought, you're never getting Tipper to shut up. Anyway, right, Rob, so takeaways. What did I say? Plan your food alongside your training. If you do nothing else, when you've got your training come in, plan what you're going to eat is probably one. Train your gut and practice race nutrition. I would say that is number 2. So work for the work required, train your gut. And then thirdly, learn new skills in the kitchen. If you can do nothing else, learn how to hold a knife, how to make a pan of soup, how to poach an egg, how to make an omelette. Learn those life skills, because cooking has become niche. And there's a lot of really good resources on the internet, and just learn new skills. So,
do you have some resources, whether it's YouTube channels or blogs or whatever it might be, that you would recommend regarding learning new skills in the kitchen?
I'm the worst person to ask, because I always claim that I've forgotten more about food than most experts will ever know, because I've been doing it. Babish, Cooking with Babish, Babish. He does some real cool stuff, and he's got millions of Instagram followers. He's worth watching. I don't watch any, mate, because I always look at it and go, I could do it better. So at some point we have thought, and I haven't had the time to do it because I'm on the road quite a lot, about doing a Performance Chef YouTube channel, because I think it'd be really cool. It's like, the best recovery meal you're ever going to get is toasted sourdough with crushed avocado and poached eggs. Most people don't know how to do a poached egg. If I could teach you how to do that and how to make a sweet potato tortilla, man, that's lunch taken care of forever. You don't need to know how to do anything else, So I think at some point, maybe when I get bored of being on the road, I'll do my own YouTube channel. But yeah, learn new cooking skills. So that would be my 3 things that I would suggest you could do.
Great. And now let's do the rapid fire questions. So take just one sentence to answer each of these. And the first one is, what's your favorite book or resource related to endurance sports?
I'm a big reader. I read a lot. I read probably 45 minutes to an hour every night. And I listen to a lot of podcasts. First and foremost, people need to subscribe to your podcast because I think it's genuinely really good. And I'm not just saying that because I'm on air. I think it's brilliant. And I think this podcast, I like your stuff a lot. I think it's good. The other one I really like is, and this will come into a book, Supporting Champions by Dr. Steve Ingham. So my favorite books currently, one that's very relevant to myself, Midlife Cyclist by Phil Cavell, talks about aging athletes and how you can continue to become less slow as you get older. I think that's a great book. Supporting Champions by Steve Ingham. He's got a podcast and a book. So for any of us practitioners that work in sport, I think it's a really good understanding about how to operate there. Renee McGregor's latest book called More Fuel You is another very good book. Renee, even though she's a very, very well-read, educated woman, can put sports science around food into layman's terms. And one more, because you've asked me to make it short, is it's a really good life manual, and it's really old, and it's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Dr. Stephen Covey. In my lifetime, I must have bought over 100 copies of this to give away to people. And it's about seeking to understand. It's about habits. It's about thinking. It's just a really good book about good habits around life. I think it's a great thing. I think it's not around endurance sport, but it's about practicing good life skills. And if you could apply them, you could cross them over. I think it would be something really good. So yeah, 7 Habits by Stephen Covey.
That's great. I think if I had asked you for one paragraph, you would have given me 20 books and read the back cover of all of them.
I love books. I've always got piles of books. The thing is, because I left school early and I'm not stupid or any such. I've got a thirst for knowledge. I love reading books. Sports science books really, I'm difficult because like your podcast for me is on the cusp of being too nerdy. And I'm just saying that because I'm not an academic. And I read a research paper the other day and I thought, Mum, why have they said 5,000 words? This is one paragraph. And academia, and they tend to overcomplicate things. And so I read sports science books, and sometimes I'll go back to them and I'll post-it note them. But I love reading. But a lot of it's more about, it's just that thirst for knowledge, because I just think you're just like a sponge. And if you don't, especially as I'm old, I'm 50, 51. I just think you just got to keep putting stuff in your head and just keep challenging yourself. So yeah, I've got lots of books. I've normally got about 6 on the go at any one time as well. So that's it. Those are the ones beside the bed currently.
Awesome. And what's an important habit that you have benefited from athletically, professionally, or personally?
I would say learning from different genres of the sport. When I first started performance chef, I left the restaurant world and I loved being in a high performing environment, but I was tired of that environment. I wasn't passionate or excited about it anymore. So I basically set a performance chef because I saw there was a missing link. And what I've endeavored to do is to work in different genres of the sport because they all have something going for them. So I started in triathlon, then athletics and time trialing, then governing body, track cycling, then road cycling, and now mountain bike. So I think don't sit still. Try and keep evolving as a person, because I could find myself a very comfortable existence, but I think that I want to keep learning, and I don't want to rest on my laurels, and I just want to keep learning from different genres of the sport. So
I love that.
That's something that's really important to me, because to stay in triathlon would have been cool, but I kind of did that with the best athlete at the time, and I just think you've just got to keep challenging. Like mountain bike at the moment, I love it. I absolutely love it, and I'm genuinely excited. There's a lot of skills that other parts of the sport could learn from mountain bike, especially the sharp end. So, it's good. Never, ever keep learning. And I think you have to keep changing stuff as well. Recognize that relationships have a timeline, both personally and professionally. And if you can't keep developing as a person, then you're just going to become comfort kills vigilance with that. And I think I go try and put myself every so often in a really new environment that I don't know anything about. Well, I hadn't watched a World Cup race, mountain bike race, before I started working in it. I'd never watched a keirin live before I started working in it, because I asked all the stupid questions. Why are they doing that? Or how's that work? Because once you think you know everything, then you're dead in a high performing environment. So yeah, keep changing.
And who's somebody that you look up to or that has inspired you?
This is difficult to summarize, because I think if you keep your eyes open in elite sport, there's always something. There's something every day, and I'm more motivated and inspired now by the human element of it, other than the purely genetics, because the amount of sub 205 East African runners out there is just boring. And I find it all, about how many South American climbers can do 6 watts per kilo while breathing out the nose. I prefer much more the human element. So if I think about this morning on the news, there was a young high diver called Andrea Sirieix. She's 17 and she medaled at the Olympics. She may have won at the Olympics, but she's a world-class diver. She's 17. She's on national television talking about body image in aesthetic sports at 17. I'm hugely inspired by that. Jesus, at 17, I can't tell you what I was doing at 17, but I didn't have the mental fortitude and capacity to talk on a global stage. So that blew my mind. I loved when I worked with Gwen Jorgensen. If I go back pre-2016, she was winning all the time, and she just had a winning mindset. And her and Pat had the view that they wouldn't do anything that wasn't going to help her win the Olympics. And to have that mental fortitude to do that week in, week out, and she was unbeatable. Evie Richards, World Mountain Bike Champion 2021, she recently did a huge piece about disordered eating whilst current world champion. Really difficult subject, so hard to talk about. She went out, and I was inspired by that. Anna Kiesenhofer in the Olympics, she went and won the Olympics, got off a front. That was a mind game. She went and she worked out how to beat the best teams in the world on her own, and she did it. Going back on the triathlon, I thought sub 7 was sub 8 was really good. I loved it. I loved the fact that Skipper turned up at the last minute and absolutely took it to him. He shouldn't have been there. He knew he shouldn't have been there, and he took it to him and did everything he had. And I think the way, again, Kath Matthews came in at the last minute, and when she ran past Spirig in the final stages of that, man, that's proper hairs on the back of the neck stuff. So I found both of those inspiring, because both of those athletes they'll be the first to admit, not have thought, they weren't the top athletes to be picked for that, but both did amazing performances, and I thought they were great. I think Jan's 7:27 solo that he did when he only had Lionel for bait in the middle of lockdown, I think that's the single most impressive performance I've seen. He had nobody, just had Lionel in a shitty day in Germany, going up and down a bit of Joe Carriageway. I would say that's probably up there. And Chelsea Sodaro winning Kona. I'll be honest, anybody that's got kids, 18 months after having a kid, to go to Kona and beat all these athletes that have got unlimited resources and unlimited time, and to do what she did, mate, that's amazing. I'll be honest with you, 18 months later, nah, especially in that sport, that is I am totally and utterly blown away with that. So I find all of those things inspiring. If you ask me to give you one person, it has to be Jan Frodeno. You look at what Jan's done and how he's created a brand and how he's become bigger than the sport. I can't think of another triathlete that is a brand, and maybe you can correct me on this, because you do, you will correct us if you think I'm talking out of hand, that's created such a brand that's as strong as Jan. I love what he stands for. He's a fairly amazing human being, and I just think the brand and the way he's managed to extend himself beyond the sport of swim, bike, run is quite something. And I don't know anybody that isn't inspired by what Jan Frodeno's done. And I know he's in the autumn of his career now, but Jan's probably the man for me. I would say that is the most inspirational, motivational person.
I agree. I think that's a great pick, and lots of great moments.
Oh, I could talk about this all day long, because I just think there's the human element that is in sport. And I've done some stuff with Jan, and I've seen how he operates when there's not a camera, there's not a press or whatever, and there's few finer human beings that you'll ever come across than that man. And again, you see somebody in a white tri-suit with blue on it, you just think Frodeno. Do you know what I mean? It's just, you never see anybody in a Ryzen. You see Ryzen, you just think it's Frodeno. You can see it. You can see the gait. You can see the build. Yeah, I can't think. Can you think of another triathlete that's kind of done that? I can't.
I mean, I would say Alistair Brownlee would maybe be up there, and maybe to a lesser extent, but still, more local than global, but Javier Gomez, I think, could. But yeah, that's not. But Alistair Brownlee would be the one that I would say realistically might be.
Alistair would have been in there. The thing is, I loved Alistair's racing. And I talked about this. And again, it's a bit. I'm going on now. You and I we're in here. We're in deep. I talked about, like, I was talking with somebody the other day about it. It was a mate of mine I was talking about, and I said, you know what? I miss having him at WTS races, bullying people, harassing them, making it uncomfortable. And these boys don't have any pressure in WTS at the moment. They don't have Alistair being like, do you remember seeing him in the bike parks with his brother? He'd get it, come on. If you weren't coming through, he'd rip your head off. And the way he used to run off the bike, mate, he was filthy to race against. And you just never knew what he was going to do. And I love that about Alistair. There was an aggression. There was a mindset. I remember watching him in Leeds. I think it might have been 2016. I was up watching the WTS. It was Olympic year. I watched it, and him and Johnny went and did a crit race around Leeds City Centre.
Yeah,
and the shit he was giving Johnny on the side of the road. He was rugging his brother, like rugging. They were miles away. I think was it Aaron Royal got away with him, and he was out the front, mate. Honestly, he was ripping him to bits, and I was like so aggressive. He had the race one. He didn't care. He didn't want to win. He wanted to obliterate everybody. And there was just something about Alistair and his pomp. There was that arrogance. There was that swagger. And unfortunately, we haven't actually seen it. Like, we never saw Alistair go toe-to-toe with Kienle, with Jan, with these boys when he's been super fit and super Alistair Brownlee. And I think we've missed an amazing opportunity. I would have loved to have seen an aggressive Alistair, a Jan in Frodeno shape against the Norwegians. Honestly, I would love to have seen it. It's not going to happen because Alistair brings something to races. He brings an unpredictability and an aggression and a tenacity that and I think WTS racing, like, I laughed as well. Where was it, Commonwealth Games? Right, I laughed when Alex Yee caught Hayden Wild and gave him a little tap and high five. Can you imagine Alistair doing that? I was just like, I'm not your mate. I'm not going on holiday with you. I'm not going to the bar with you afterwards. I'm going to rip your head. Can you imagine? That would never have happened. And he wouldn't have done it with his brother. He certainly would never have done it. Could you imagine? I just saw this. Yeah. It was just, So I think I would agree. Alistair's he's a truly iconic athlete. I just wish we could have seen him rip it long course. I mean, properly full Brownlee madness when he's got the madness in him, and we haven't seen it. We haven't seen the madness.
We haven't. I'm not quite ready to give up on it yet, though.
No. There's something there, and the thing is as well. You write off that man at your peril because you know what There's something about him. He's made from different minerals. No, I would agree. I would totally agree. I just hope that he can bring it all together because I'd love to see him just bring the madness. Just the madness. Yeah. You know what I mean with the madness. The Brownlee madness. Yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it.
All right. Well, this has been a great chat, Alan. Thank you so much. Where can people follow you and find you online?
The only real platform I'm using all the time is Instagram. So I'm performance.chef on Instagram. I do stuff about time trialing and food, try and keep it real, post recipes on there. We do nutrition plans, which is through performancechef.com. But get in touch with us on the gram. We've got a couple of pretty cool books. We've got The Cycling Chef, Volume 1 and 2, which are Bloomsbury. You can buy them from Satan's Bookshop, which is Amazon. They're available on there, and they've got recipes that work. They've all been tested on Olympians and world-class athletes, so they all work. And we've got another 2 books that are hopefully going to be out next year. So buy books off Amazon and then look at Instagram for good recipes. So,
yeah, it's good option for Christmas gifts, perhaps for triathlon or endurance sports friends and family.
No, and the recipes work, and they genuinely work. And there's I don't think there's many recipe books you can say that every single recipe is being tested in a world class environment, and they have, and they all work. And we've got macros and everything. So what you do is get yourself MyFitnessPal, because you love it, Michael. You get the books and you can just link all your macros together. And then this time next year, you'll be saying, my God, I've PB'd everything and I've done all this cool stuff. So brilliant.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Thank you. I look forward to talking again soon, Alan. It's been great. So thank you so much.
Cheers. Thanks for having me on.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview. As you could tell, I could talk to Alan for hours, and well, we did for a couple of hours, and actually we did talk for 1 more hour after we finished recording. So clearly, at the very least, I enjoyed the conversation that we had. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com. I have probably 15 links there to various episodes and resources and books, so I'm not going to name any of them. Just check it out if you're interested. They are related to the episode that we just had. And next Monday on the podcast, I will interview Erin Carson, who has been on the podcast before a few years ago. She's a strength training coach specializing in working with endurance athletes. And I've been thinking for a while that it's time to get her back on again. But what really triggered me to stop thinking and start emailing was that in the Women's 73 World Championship, all 3 podium athletes, Taylor Knibb, Paula Findlay, and Emma Pallant-Brown, works with her for their strength training. So we'll hear about that and a bunch of other things around strength training for triathletes in next week's interview. Before we finish, I want to remind you to check out our training camp in Mallorca at the end of March. You can find all the information about it on scientifictriathlon.com, and you can of course email me directly if you want to learn more or if you want to register. It will be an amazing week of training. Mallorca is an amazing place to train. The cycling there is stunning, so don't miss the opportunity to come and train with a bunch of like-minded people and build some great fitness ahead of your 2023 season. Finally, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that you can find on precisionfuelandhydration.com. Use their free fuel and hydration planner to understand your fluid, electrolyte, and carbohydrate needs, and get a specific and effective race strategy, and book a free video consultation with the team if you want to refine your plan further. Use the code TTS22 at checkout for 15% off your first order of their products. And thank you to Zen8. Use the Zen8 swim trainer to improve your technique, power, stamina, and swim training consistency. You can try the Zen8 risk-free for up to 30 days and get the special Zen8 and TTS bundle, including a swim trainer and a number of Zen8 training plans and on-demand workouts on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.